Boom.
There we go.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Brett.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thanks, Britt.
You bet.
And because I can't see a share feature either, which is usually right around here somewhere. Is it this one? No. Dang. I'm going to put the questions in the chat. See if that'll help. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for letting me pivot well enough. Thank you for joining us as we embark upon a conversation around set-asides. Willing to let the conversation evolve as it does. Our first question really centers on input on the idea of moving away from a percentage or figure amount of total resources to any given set aside to a project minimum. That would be informed by an analysis of the last couple cycles of every program. The department is considering really working through pairing resources that potentially are usually paired together, pairing resources that may be newly paired together. And so, yes, I see hands. Jillian.
Angela, before we jump into this robust conversation, I was wondering if you could clarify, you mentioned in the bigger group what some of the set-asides are statutorily.
Yes.
And with LIFT, you said it was, I don't remember exactly what you said about the division with rural, but could you just review that again before we jump in?
Yes. So LIFT in particular has a legislative intent, meaning that when the legislature put it together, they did not craft the language in such a way that required a must, but has a may, and then doubled down with additional language around rural and communities of color. So those are the two kind of legislatively intended populations and geographies that the resource is intended to fund. But there's wiggle room there because of the way the statute's
Got
written.
it. Okay.
And I think I saw Becky in the room, and she should call me if I'm wrong as the LIFT manager.
You are correct. It is. We actually have it currently in our rules as how the set aside is laid out right now. We typically we have a 50% split, but that is, like I said, it's in rule and can be changed.
Okay. Thank you. That really helps.
Kevin?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for this. I think Michael said something really important about developing strategic priorities for funding. And I think it goes without saying that the development of those priorities should be transparent and vetted out with plenty of evidence that's somehow, like, I don't know how we would say this, but like in academia, peer reviewed. And that should drive the allocation splits, both geographically and either whether it's by use, by organization, by level of income, geographic, however you change those strategic priorities should be the driver. And I think if you look at Washington's, the way they've allocated on their 5 regions, it would be worth, Ty said something about the California, Washington, and Minnesota examples, but then I appreciated that he says, I can't speak to whether these are successful models or just models. But Washington has certainly created because there are some regions that are just like, okay, we're not going to ever get a 9% ever again. And so does this change up every year? Does it follow trends? I think it needs to be more clear than just geographic or by income. So thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thanks. Feedback from there, Robin?
Hi. So I'm just trying to figure out what
problem we're trying to solve. Are you guys having an issue with how it currently works that this would make it easier for you, or it would make it better for tenants, or it would distribute money more fairly? Or I'm just trying to understand what the basis is for making a change.
Sure. So I think the premise is definitely that we are moving to a centralized application, which means that all of the set-asides that were individually crafted via program framework for the individual programs are still in place. But we have an opportunity in moving to a centralized application where one application comes in for any number of potential department resources to create set-asides that better align with potential department priorities. We've received feedback that the priorities, and not just the priorities, but the definitions of those set-asides vary from program to program at this point, and that creates an environment where it's very difficult for a project to essentially tee up in preparation for one program source and then potentially be unsuccessful, and then have to completely remodel their program on the project for a different funding source. So the hope here is that in addition to, hopefully winding back even more than that, we can see community-driven projects have a pathway forward through set-asides that are not so much point-driven, but that are a bit more organic, and that our set-asides can be larger buckets that are responsive to those community-driven needs. As at this point, right, it is kind of a points game program to program. And this is an opportunity for us to revisit, the buckets of which we are allocating resources. I hope that answered the question, Robin.
Yeah,
But
thank you.
those are the two key driving forces. I guess we could call them problems or not, but they're the driving force. One could always, I guess, keep it the way it is. We'll set aside, even in a centralized funding, that we say home or lift has these set asides, but it doesn't work. So I think the challenge that we're with your help trying to figure out, now that we're putting it all together in one application process, how do we ensure that meeting our policy and state and agency priorities, how we can utilize that centralized now? Yeah. So it's, rather than breaking out those set asides by individual programs, we don't want to leave funding unused, because that's one of the issues that in individual funding, some of them go unused. Now it becomes a challenge. Okay, where do we put them? How do we categorize? How do we prioritize where to put this funding that wasn't not enough or wouldn't work in this particular scenario? So now, when put them all together, I think it gives us a different opportunity to explore those set asides, and also for us to accomplish our policy priorities and objectives as well. Jillian, go ahead. I see your hand.
I know we have limited time, so I wanted to jump in with a recommendation, and I did put it on the board as well. And it was why I asked the question about PABs. So rural projects tend to be smaller and struggle to get good pricing and syndicate, whereas urban projects tend to be larger and banks tend to have more of a CRA need in those areas. So as we're thinking about set-asides, I think we should start thinking about also what we're setting aside for where that makes sense. Setting aside a larger percentage of the lift without LIHTC, so larger subsidy per unit, but no LIHTC, no PABs, and allocate more of that to the rural areas, and then allocate the PABs with lift to areas that are more likely to have large projects that can syndicate, that can get better LIHTC pricing, right? I think that thinking about it in that way, about where are these dollars being used and how, because before this, I looked at who was awarded lift in the last couple of years and how big the projects were and where they were. And there's only one urban project that had lift without LIHTC, and it was a really small project. I think it was like 16, 18 units. So like small project / rural doesn't make sense to pair that with PABs. Not all of them. I'm sure there are large rural projects that absolutely need LIHTC, and I want them to have it. But splitting that up in a way that makes sense based on who's using what, who historically has used what resource, seems like it could be a win-win-win, right? Because the other priority for LIFT, as you stated, Angela, is communities of color. And we know that most of the communities of color in the state live in urban areas. So, you know, if we want to hit those priorities, both rural and communities of color, figuring out, you know, how to use LIFT differently, not always pairing it. We know we're not going to have enough PABs for all $650 million in LIFT. It's just math. So prioritizing, putting the LIFT where it's going to give us, or the PABs where it's going to give us the most bang for our buck, and, you know, increasing the subsidy for rural projects so that they can get done without needing to syndicate and take, you know, 82 cents on the dollar, I think makes, you know, we'll have more production, we'll have faster production, and we'll create more units. So I did put that onto the set aside board, but like I said, I know we have limited time, so I wanted to make sure I did research before this, and I really wanted to make sure I was able to give that suggestion, because I think it's actionable and it makes sense, and I think it would, you know, meet a lot of OHCS priorities.
That's really fair. Thank you. And I think it kind of dovetails well into, so there's not going to be PABs, right? So we do have a biennium's worth of LIFT, and a biennium's worth of gap funds and state resources. And we are assigning our 24 PAB now, right? So it kind of helps us push. So like, let's take PABs and shelve them, because I think you're absolutely right. And we, to yours and Kevin's points around data-driven metrics and successful projects, and teeing up subsidy size to project success via geographies. And I think there's a number of conversations happening about subsidy resource limits, and how those come together in the new world of centralized offering. If we swing back to priorities as a measure of things that are not mandated, what things need protection and access to. And so I think that's the other big piece of the conversation. I think it's probably happening some in the ERJ space, but it should happen here also, because we do currently have set asides. And I think Becky can attest some to whether or not her she didn't offer the set aside a second time because it wasn't successful.
Mm-hmm.
And so experience from the developer side around, like, well, I aim for this set aside, and maybe it is primarily geographically driven, but we have, like, our tribal lands on the 9% is totally underutilized. Mm-hmm. It's like, so I don't know if folks have feedback there on like other opportunities. I think the other folks are staff and everybody else help kind of stretch out, you know, do nonprofits or culturally specific, like we allow a soft set aside for 9s for culturally specific sponsors to have a soft priority. That soft priority has been rendered moot because we also have a nonprofit priority that we have to have first. So so like we give the preference to the generic nonprofit, not to the culturally specific nonprofit first, because of the way the QAP spells out the funding passes. So overall, are there any project types, developer types, that folks feel like need or deserve protected access via a set aside?
I mean, I think you consider doing, you know, I know family housing is a big struggle to get done, especially large bedroom sizes, 3s and 4s. We talk about family housing being 2 bedrooms, but in the community outreach that we've been doing for years, the culturally specific groups that we've been talking to, the Latina community, the African immigrant community. 2 bedrooms is not enough for the size of those families, and certainly not enough for intergenerational families. And so you could, consider a set aside based on bedroom density. I think it's worthwhile to continue to prioritize culturally specific, culturally relevant chodos and nonprofits, because if you look statistically, those are the ones that have the service providers that are in the communities that have lower eviction rates. And on the one hand, production is production, and we need more units. On the other hand, if we are, trying to meet these goals of the LIFT legislation, we have to build who we build housing for, and how we do it is important too. So those don't always have to be hard set asides, but I think grassroots organizations that have their boards are representative of the people that they're serving, either by income or race or gender or all. Those are significant measures of organizations that are being successful in doing the work of outreach and recruiting.
There is the easy retro board. So if you have other thoughts, or you don't want to put them out here verbally, you can put them on the retro board as well. I think I'm just looking at some of the chat as well. I think one of the key questions we're asking is also that do we do a set aside by number of projects, or maybe versus amount of money. So anyway, so if any additional thoughts to that, or any other input on the questions that are on the for this conversation, that'd be great as well.
Yeah, I would love feedback on that. Emily.
Hi, everyone. Emily Lieb, she, her pronouns. I'm with Metro, popping in late. So sorry if intro has already happened. I don't know if this has come into the conversation yet, but just being thoughtful about local funding and how it is or isn't, and being intentional, I guess, about how we are using layering or complementing local funding sources with LIFT. And so I think it relates to your question, because there are remaining Metro bond awards that have remaining gaps, and it's kind of like the end of the Metro affordable housing bond. So there are some projects that I believe have competed for funding with a plan to go out and compete for LIFT funding. They've asked us, like, what's the process? What's the availability? We've said we don't know. Like, we don't know if you can count on LIFT funding being able to layer. And so, ideally we would have like intentional and coordinated, so any opportunities to kind of coordinate and align with local funding, I think would be just the broader theme, so that we can have a consistent message. And I really liked Jillian's idea of like looking at projects that, project types that aren't a good fit for tax credits, that might be a good fit for directing some portion of LIFT resources in rural areas. I know also like smaller projects could be a good fit for that. So I think there are some creative ways to think about LIFT in the context of all the pots of funding, and think about like how they can complement one another to achieve the shared goals. Yeah.
So on that note, Emily, just picking up, or I guess on what you just said, because I don't follow it closely, but on the Metro bond or other jurisdiction funders, are there set asides in the same tone that we're talking about here? So if let's say Metro has, and maybe we haven't looked at it in a way that then we can leverage. So if we, the state, has set asides that align and support your set asides, yeah, then our resources would go even farther. So I'm curious if Metro as such has any such things as set asides.
Well, we have an allocation framework, not exactly. So we have a geographic framework. Our funds were allocated on the, from the start to jurisdictions using a distribution formula. So that's, the 3 counties in the metro area and the 4 cities that administer bond funds. And then they put out solicitations. I think, there were, some lessons learned in terms of the need for coordination. And I think like in the future, if we have, more local resources, we're going to need a coordinated calendar so that all 7 of those partners aren't putting their resources out at the same time, or all of, like there's going to need to be some planning around that. But we did establish a structure for distributing funds within the metro region. That's kind of an established framework that's based on, really it was based on like tax generation, but it ties very closely to population. We looked at a bunch of other measures of need, but I would have to look at them because it's been 5 years. So we do have an established framework for distributing our resources in the metro region. And we do have, I think we need to do there was a round of local solicitations that went out over the summer. And so I think we could do a little more work to pull together from those outcomes where there are projects that we know of that have said, we're going to go after lift funds. I don't know that we don't have that all pulled together in one place, but I know I've been seeing that, and the question has been coming to us
So nothing as such as saying funding for culturally specific, culturally responsive organizations.
Sorry. So there are some. So Washington County has a set aside for Chodos. There's not a consistent practice across our jurisdictional partners, but we have a lot of criteria around, and I think that's kind of an area of improvement to get more specific and more standardized around how we, culturally specific organizations are competitively scored. I forget, Washington County did have a set aside for Chodos, and I think it was 25% in one of their NOFAs, but that's not a metro standard.
All right, thank you.
So I think with our remaining 4 minutes, maybe we can double down. Oh, Kevin. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Kevin, you're muted.
Mute. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I wasted a few of our precious seconds, but I just wanted to agree with Jillian and Emily and other discussions about preferences for BIPOC-led development organizations. But I think for-profit or nonprofit, we are balancing a production, a mighty production target that we have to consider. But the one thing I just wanted to mention to Emily about, I agree 100% with coordinating amongst the agencies on funding cycles and purposes of money and eligible activities. But what I just want to caution against is mandating that funds from any one agency be paired with funds from another agency, because that is very problematic when it skews the whole arrangement. So I just, my 2 cents on that one.
Solid, thank you. And I think I think there was an element of the question around transparency and the idea of moving from per project, like a project versus a dollar amount for those allocations to those set asides. And so I don't know if folks have feedback on ways we could be, because at this point, a set aside, there's 10% of the 2 million and 9% credits that's going to go to tribal land set aside. And so we're trying to think through how we also create transparency if we were to shift to a project minimum funded by set aside. And I don't know if folks have thoughts on that. I saw Kate's comment in the chat around a yes to the idea of a number of projects versus a dollar amount. And maybe it's a combination of both. or if folks have feedback around how they would envision transparency at the department level for available resources, especially since the current thinking is that you would come in and have potential access to any applicable sources your project may be eligible for.
I just want to add strategic priorities, matching the outcome with solving the problem. Number of projects may not mean anything, right? Number of units, number of bedrooms, amount of services, location, other cost of development, and so forth. All these other criteria fit into how you would address a systemic issue. That once you've identified it, find an answer that way.
Thanks. Anybody else? I see Lydia added yes to number of projects. It starts to decouple set-asides from subsidy per limit metrics. And I think that's the other kind of really important piece is the subsidy per limit metric transparency enough to do the math backwards in terms of if we had kind of a running tally of projects, and I know this is, really like trying to get us away from the PAB conversation because that resource is so oversubscribed that we need to get strategic about all of the remaining state resources. So if there's any additional comment on that in our last minute.
I guess I have a question. Is there, with the new LIFT resources, is there a unit goal?
That's a good question.
A unit production goal?
Not that we are aware or that we establish or that we've been required to do. I think we are, in general terms, trying to work with the governor's goal. So that we'll have to consider as well, but no, we don't have anything specific about that right now.
Yeah, again, I would go back to what has been working with different communities, right? If smaller projects work and one type of developer and larger projects work in another, it makes sense to start doing it per project, but also looking at those subsidy caps. But I know that subsidy cap is a different engagement session, so I don't want to get too deep into it.
Yes.
But yeah, we got to do what makes sense and what gets the most units on the ground and what's serving our values and our priorities as a community of developers.
Well, we thank you for your time. And again, I think it's that consolidated approach will give us a different, working base around some of this. Because some organizations that, yes, haven't had the capacity or they're small to compete in other arenas or go for tax credits. But being able to pick from this pool of resources, I think there's a better chance that how